O Lord, open thou our hearts to hear, through thy word to us draw near. Let us thy word, air pure retain. Let us thy children, and heirs remain. Amen. Have you been wearing your helmet this week? I mean, your helmet of the hope of salvation, that is. That was our message last week. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 8. The Apostle Paul told us to prepare for that day of the Lord's coming, the Lord's day, by being fitted with the helmet that God gives us, the helmet of the hope of salvation. And last week, in order to illustrate that, I brought with a memento from my years working at the chemical company and told you about how I had to wear a helmet. I was required to for those years of my life. And I brought that as an example to show you. And then after the sermon, a lot of you came to me and talked to me and mentioned how you had to wear a helmet for a certain profession you were in, some kind of a hard hat, or that you wished you had one when you bumped your head doing something and you would have benefited from having one. And so we talked about helmets. But when I was putting that message together last week, I was also thinking about a movie my wife and I had watched just a few months ago. There's a movie starring Will Smith. It was called Concussion. It came out in 2015. It's a movie about a profession in which people are required, everyone who participates has to wear a helmet, and yet a helmet is not enough. The helmet that protects the head from the blow is not enough to protect the head from multiple and repeated blows that happen over and over again over the course of time. And then that can manifest brain damage that comes along later, sometimes 10 to 20 years later. And it took a medical examiner, a brilliant one, to discover this. A medical examiner with multiple degrees. His name was Dr. Bennett Omalu. And he did some research, and he was able to connect some links and point back to the cause of this brain issue that was taking place, the syndrome called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy is what they call it. And he was able to link it back to this. And it not only took somebody who had the knowledge and medical knowledge to be able to do that, but it took somebody like Dr. Omalu, who didn't have the biases of an American citizen because he wasn't born here. He's a Nigerian physician. And so he didn't have our cultural bias against one of our nation's favorite pastimes, which is what this was all about. When you connected all the links and the dots, it all pointed back to something Americans love. The National Football League. Football was the issue. And so the movie we watched called Concussion, that starred Will Smith. Will Smith was approached and asked to play Dr. Bennett Omalu in this movie. And Will Smith, when he was getting ready to consider that, was very conflicted about whether he was going to take that offer and play the role or not, because he loves the NFL. And his son plays football. And so he was conflicted. He was uneasy about taking a role in which he would have to take sides on the issue, until he heard something that Dr. Bennett Omalu had said in this whole controversy. Bennett Omalu had said, "Truth doesn't have a side." And so Will Smith decided to accept the role. Accepted the role in this, which he thought was going to be a lightning rod film that was going to shake up the whole football industry. And it ended up not being that big of a splash in the pan. And yet before it happened, Smith thought it would be. And so he was quoted by USA Today in December of 2015, just before the movie came out. And he was quoted saying this. He said, "There is a historical river that runs red with the blood of truth tellers. And so it's not uncommon to kill a messenger." There's a historical river that runs red with the blood of truth tellers, and so it's not uncommon to kill the messenger. That's what Will Smith said. Now, he didn't expect that he himself would be killed over this, but he also expected he wouldn't be well-liked either. And he said he didn't think the NFL executives were going to invite him with free tickets to the Super Bowl that season. But the reason I bring all this up about Concussion and that movie is because what Will Smith said there is very fitting for what Jesus is talking about in Matthew chapter 25. Jesus is talking about that same day, the Lord's Day, when the Lord returns. Only he's describing a different scene of it. This isn't the scene of destruction that we talked about last week. This is the scene of the Lord gathering together all the people around him and what Jesus is going to say to them when they all gather. And so the beginning of our text from Matthew chapter 25 is where Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory, with all his angels with him, then he will sit upon his glorious throne. And before him will be gathered all the nations, and he will separate people, one from another, as a shepherd separates sheep from the goats. And the sheep he will put on his right, and the goats on his left. Judgment Day. That's how we usually describe it. It's the day of the Lord's judgment. And there's no jury present, notice. There is just the king, just the judge. And so we don't have to worry about a hung jury on that day. There's not going to be any mistrial. And there'll be no objections sustained in this court, because the one who judges is the highest court. There's no chance of appealing this to a higher court afterwards. This is the highest court. This is the one that Paul's talking about in Philippians chapter 2, verse 11, when he says, at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. This is the day he's imagining, when all people will stand before the Lord and will recognize him as God and King, King of kings and Lord of lords. Now, the scriptures are clear. He is that already. And yet to us, we think of the United States, and we think, well, the president or the Congress, or at least the Supreme Court is in charge here in our land. Or we tend to think of the UN Security Council as having some authority to bring peace among nations on our earth. But in reality, the scriptures say that Jesus is in charge of it all. So Hebrews 2 is a great passage about this, because in Hebrews 2, it talks about how God the Father has given all authority in all things to Jesus. And so in verse 8 and 9 it says, the Father, in subjecting everything to him, left nothing outside of his control. At the present, we do not see everything subjected to him, but we see him who for a time was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 8 and 9. What's so great about this king, our king, and I'm assuming that everyone in here is here because you would be able to say that about Jesus, that he is your king too. He is our king. What's great about this king is not only is he over all, but he is not above demonstrating explicitly that he is willing to serve each one of us, even the lowliest, even the most worthless one among us. And that's why this passage in Hebrews chapter 2 is so wonderful, because it goes on, after saying that about everything being under his control, to say that he is not ashamed to call us brothers, call us sisters, his own brothers and sisters. That's verse 11. And then verses 14 to 15 go on to say, since the children, that is us, the children of God, share in flesh and blood, he too partook of the same things, so that by death he might destroy him who has the power over death, that is the devil, thereby freeing, releasing, delivering those who through fear of death have been in lifelong slavery. This king, who's outside of the bounds of flesh and blood, has entered into flesh and blood, became flesh and blood with us, so that we could be the children of God, to release us from this lifelong slavery, this bondage that we're already in, this imprisonment that we've already been sentenced into, this fate that's worse than any kind of jail time or even execution, because it's an eternal punishment without parole. That's where we were, and he's already released us from all of that. That's what Hebrews is saying. Why then is there a judgment? Why then does there need to be a judgment? Because before Christ ascended, see, then, Matthew 25 says, he will ascend and take his glorious throne, and all the nations stand before him. But if then he's going to stand on his throne, but he's already come before he ever ascended that throne and released us from the sentence that we're under, this slavery and bondage to death, why then does there need to be a judgment day? What is there left to do on that day? Well, why doesn't Jesus just say in Matthew 25, verse 34, and say it to everybody? Matthew 25, this reading could be really short. It could be just Jesus in verse 34 saying, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you since the foundation of the world. And there it is. But Jesus only says that to the people on his right. And to the people on his left, Jesus speaks further. In verse 40, he tells them, depart from me, you cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels. Why are there people on the left side? Why are there people? If that's not prepared for people, did you notice Jesus said that? Prepared for the devil and his angels? The inheritance of the Father is prepared for people. This is prepared for the devil and his angels. So why are there people on the left? Why are there people who are sent there if it's not even prepared for that? But Jesus' words, as he continues, describes why. It's all about who has recognized him as Lord and is willing to receive him as Lord after what he has done for them. And Jesus points then to the evidence of this that's taking place in their lives. And so to those who received him, he says, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was naked, you clothed me. When I was sick, you visited me. When I was in prison, you came to me. And then to the ones on his left, he shares with them the evidence. When I was hungry, you did not feed me. When I was thirsty, you did not give me to drink. When I was a stranger, you did not welcome me. When I was naked, you did not clothe me. When I was sick and in prison, you did not visit me. And neither group has any idea what he's talking about. Neither one of them understand. They're all baffled by it. The ones who are blessed say it in astonishment. The ones who are cursed say it in objection. But they all say the same thing. They say, when, Lord? When did we see you? The ones who are blessed are so astonished that they have seen him at some point and welcomed him and fed him and gave him to drink. The ones on the other side are raising an objection for why they're being sent over to that side. And yet the objection is sustained by what Jesus goes on to say. As Jesus goes on to say to those on his right, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. To those on his left, he says, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. The difference between those on the right and those on the left is how they received the siblings of Jesus. Jesus' brothers. Whatever you did not do for the least of these brothers of mine. Now we just went through Hebrews chapter 2. About how Hebrews chapter 2 talks about the way that we are all flesh and blood. And so he wasn't ashamed to call us brothers and sisters. So he too partook in our flesh and blood. In that sense, all people are the brothers and sisters of God through Christ because he partook in our flesh and blood. But in the Gospel of Matthew, what we're looking at, Jesus gets even more specific about who are the brothers and sisters of Christ. So Matthew chapter 12, Jesus is in a house. And there's lots of people gathered there. So many people gathered that the entrances are crowded and nobody can get in, nobody can get out. People are straining to hear, even through the windows. And there are some people in there who are believing everything Jesus said, because Jesus is talking about his reign and his rule in their lives. And they are believing everything he said, so much so that they say to one another in Matthew chapter 12, can this be the son of David? And when they're saying that, they mean, is this the king who's going to reign on the throne of David forever and ever? It's the one that Ezekiel talked about at the end of our Old Testament lesson, when God said, and my prince David, and my servant David will be prince over them forever. It's the one that was promised to David back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 12 to 13, when the Lord said to David, when you lie down with your fathers and your days are fulfilled, I will raise up one from your offspring after you, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom, and it will never end. And the people are looking at each other as they're listening to Jesus about his reign and rule, and they say to one another, can this be that son of David? They're ready to believe in him and receive him as Lord. At the same time, there are other people in that same crowded house who are only there to raise objection. And their objection is that this man's authority comes from another place. And so they say, it's only by the prince of demons, Beelzebul, that this man casts out demons. And we call them the Pharisees. And while they're all gathered there in this group, and this controversy is going on, guess who comes outside? Jesus' mother and his brothers. And in Matthew chapter 12, they're even named. So this is Mary, who's in the Christmas story, Jesus' mother, and his brothers are named James and Judas and Simon and Joseph. And they're there. So they are physiologically the half-brothers of Jesus, born of the same mother, Mary, grew up in the same household with Jesus. So in that sense, every much brothers of Jesus, every sense brothers of Jesus. And there they are outside, and Jesus is inside, and the message starts to pass through the crowds. His mother and brothers are here. His mother and brothers are here. His mother and brothers are here. Until the message gets to Jesus. Your mother and brothers are outside. And Jesus looks to all those gathered in front of him, and he says, who are my mother and my brothers? And he points to his disciples. He said, you are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of my Father is my brother and sister and mother. And it's these faithful who are his brother and sister and mother, those who believed in him and his reign and rule and everything he was bringing to this world, those who believed it. They are the faithful who were there when he went to the cross, when he tasted death by the grace of God for all of us. They're the faithful who waited in an upper room, not knowing what was going to happen after he was crucified. They are the faithful who went to the tomb that morning to finish the burial and anoint his body. And one of those was a woman named Mary, who Luke 8:12 tells us 7 demons were cast out of. She knew where Jesus' authority came from. Not by the prince of demons, but it came from himself. And she's the first one that Jesus showed himself to when he rose from the dead. And when Jesus showed himself to her, he said to her, it's Matthew chapter 28, verse 10. He said, go and tell my brothers that I'm going ahead of them to Galilee, and there they will see me. See, when Jesus talks about his brothers in the Gospel of Matthew, when he talks about his siblings, he's talking about people who have believed in him, who have trusted in him. He's talking about those who have witnessed to him. He's talking about the disciples. They are the messengers. They are the witnessers who've witnessed his authority and his reign in this world, and are telling other people about it. And that's why in Matthew chapter 10, verse 40, this is what Jesus said to them when he first sent them out. He said, whoever receives you, receives me. And whoever receives me, receives him who sent me. And now, these disciples are those witnesses to the truth and authority of Jesus and to the saving gift of his death and resurrection in our lives. And so when Jesus sits on his glorious throne on that fateful day that Matthew 25 is talking about, and he says, as you did it to the least of these brothers of mine, you did it to me. He's not simply talking about feeding those who are hungry and giving drink to those who are thirsty and taking care of those in need who have no place to stay. But he's talking about how did you receive his messengers? His messengers. The king's messengers. Because it's that hospitality of welcome and feeding and encouragement that shows that you're receiving not only the messengers themselves, but the king who sends the message. These are the messengers of the king. And to receive the messengers is to receive him. And those who receive that message are welcomed into the eternal kingdom. And those who have not received that message, well, they're not invited in. Because it's not a kingdom, it's not something you actually enter. We think of it as a place. So we kind of have this sense in mind that here's Jesus sitting on his glorious throne, and behind him are some gates. And after he says, come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom, that people are going to walk past him and walk through these gates, and then they're in the kingdom. But when Jesus speaks of kingdom, he's not talking primarily about a place, but instead he's talking about the reign and rule of the king. And that's why he doesn't say enter into the kingdom. He says inherit the kingdom that has been prepared for you from the foundation of the world. A kingdom that you're already a part of, because you are a part of the gracious reign and rule of the Savior. Those who have welcomed the loving rule of the Lord Jesus in their lives here and now will continue in that loving rule even to eternity. But those who would not have the rule and the reign of Jesus in this life, well, Jesus is not going to force it on them in the next either. What was it Will Smith said? There's a historical river raging that runs red with the blood of truth tellers. And so it's not uncommon to kill the messenger. Well, Jesus nuances that a little bit. He says you don't even have to kill the messenger to be caught up in that river. Because that's a raging river that continues in every generation, and it is still flowing, and it ends in a lake of fire that it will not put out. And you don't have to kill the messenger to end up in that current, but simply ignoring the messengers, ignoring the message, gets you caught up in that current. And Jesus is inviting everyone to find their way out, to be his brothers and sisters, to join him in the family of God, by letting him have his way in our lives. So let the Lord Jesus have his way with you. Let his priorities, let his word, let it set the direction for your life and for your future. Because that's what it means to have him as a gracious king. And if we have him as a gracious king in our life, well, then we will be taking care of those around us who are the messengers of him, who have received him as their king, and we'll be feeding them, and we'll be clothing them, and we'll be welcoming them, and we'll be caring for them, even if we don't notice it. But rest assured, he won't miss it. He won't fail to take notice. For he'll notice everything we do, for as we do it, to the least of the brothers of his, we have done it for him. And we continue until that day when Jesus says to all of us, come, you who've been blessed by my Father, inherit this kingdom that's been prepared for you since the foundation of the world. In Jesus' name.